Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the third webinar in our Skills in Action series on reskilling for the future, labor market shifts in the energy transition. My name is Prerna Seth, and I'm a fellow at Just Jobs Network, a global think tank that focuses on employment and effective governance of labor markets across the world. We're very pleased to have you all with us today. This webinar is a part of the FuturWORKS Collective, which is an interdisciplinary research consortium examining the future of work in the Global South. This consortium has been launched by the International Development Research Centre of Canada and is a collective that is spread across 5 regions, including Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America and the Caribbean. Just Jobs Network is very pleased and honored to play the role of coordinating this entire global consortium. And it brings us great pleasure to work with amazing research organizations across the Global South, looking at the future of work as we undergo rapid technological advancement and human-induced climate change. Labor markets across the world are undergoing significant transformation, and this collective is really committed to examining how these effects are translating to workers, businesses, and economies at large. As I mentioned, this is our third webinar in the series. In the first 2 webinars, we looked at, we talked about the similarities as well as divergent challenges facing labor markets with respect to skills in the Global South. And we also specifically looked at how AI is evolving and what this means for developing countries in terms of the positive as well as disruptive impacts it's having on labor markets. Our focus in today's webinar is going to be on energy transitions. As the world transitions from fossil fuels to renewable energy, this transition is reshaping labor markets and economies and government structures at multiple scales. The structural shift involves not only changes in resource utilization and control, but also significant realignment of energy policies, of patterns of economic development, as well as job creation and unemployment. And for the Global South, it is extremely important to be talking about how this transition impacts labor markets, especially because of the heterogeneous and highly informal nature of labor markets. And on the one hand, we have estimates from multilateral organizations and research institutions talking about the number of jobs that will be created and the number of jobs that will be lost. And the dominant response to managing these labor market shifts is really to retrain workers from fossil fuel dependent jobs to be able to take up roles in more green industries. But if past economic transitions have shown us anything, it is that this is not a straightforward process. You can't simply move workers from a dying industry to emerging industries. There are many other factors to take into consideration, and there are many other factors that impact this transition. So the goal of today's webinar is really to address this gap and get into the weeds of what reskilling for the energy transition really means. And to what extent and under what conditions is this an effective policy response to ensure just transition for workers? I'm very excited to be hosting this discussion with our esteemed panelists, and it promises to be an extremely thought-provoking and engaging session today. I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers with us. We have Presha Ramsuru. Presha is the director of the Center for Researching Education and Labor at the University of Witwatersrand. Her work explores the evolving nature of occupations during the green transition with a focus on changing skill requirements. We also have with us Mark Ayub. Mark is an energy policy researcher and an associate fellow at the American University of Beirut's Issam Fares Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs. His work revolves around influencing policymaking through evidence-based research with a focus on energy transition in Lebanon and the MENA region. Next, we have Aryan Dehan. Aryan is a senior program specialist in climate adaptation and resilience at the International Development Research Center. He supports Southern-based research that integrates climate and gender equity into policy analysis, focusing on sustainable recoveries and transition to low-carbon economies. And last but not the least, my colleague at JJN, Gregory Randolph. Gregory is the founding partner at Just Jobs Network and assistant professor at the School of City and Regional Planning at Georgia Institute of Technology. Gregory studies how local economies and urbanization patterns are shaped by technological, energy, and demographic transitions with a focus on inequality. Welcome, everybody, and very excited about today's conversation. We'll start today's discussion with about 40 minutes of Q&A with our speakers, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of audience Q&A. Please feel free during the discussion, during the first half of the conversation, to share your questions in the chat box, and time permitting, we might ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question once we turn to the audience Q&A part. All right. So let's get started. We have limited time and a lot of ground to cover. I'd like to start by discussing and by examining the implications of the energy transition for labor markets across and within regions. And maybe, Presha, if I could ask you first, and then Mark, to really talk about, what are the dynamics of the energy transition in your respective regions? What are some of the key concerns it raises for you? And what are the groups of workers that you think are, set to gain and lose the most during this transition? So, Presha, if I could hand it over to you to talk about your work in Africa, and then Mark.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you again for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity for us to share some of the work that we do at the Witsreal Center, studying education, labor market relationships. So I think I'm going to start with taking a step back and actually looking at the background and the context within which Africa's energy transition, and I'll start with some contextualization of South Africa's energy transition is actually taking place. But none of the elements that I'm going to pick out, I think, are different from the 8 African countries that we have been studying. So the first thing, this energy transition is taking place in context of extreme poverty, where in South Africa, 55% of people are living in poverty. There's untenable levels of unemployment. In South Africa, around 30% of the population is unemployed. And if we're looking at youth, it's about 65%. If we look at inequality, I'm sure many of you know South Africa is positioned as one of the most unequal countries in the world. Alongside that, we have a weak economy. Growth rates have declined over the last decade. Post-recovery is constrained by insecure electricity supply, among other constraints, some of which I've mentioned. We are regarded as one of the most carbon-intensive major economies in the world. And we probably are Africa's largest carbon emitter, driving about 40% of the continent's total emissions. But alongside that, we're also a population that's extremely vulnerable to climate risk. We've already seen that the impact of climate on not just workers as well as workers and education is already evident across Africa. Last year, South Africa reported about 12,000 students experienced school disruption because of climate-related incidents. We had over 3,000 deaths of children under 5. So the energy transition, I'm trying to depict it. And besides that, we're also vulnerable to transition risk. Our exports are under threat. So South Africa's energy transition is positioned very strongly as a transformative transition. And that's quite important. It is an opportunity for a new growth path. And it's an integral ambition of South Africa's energy transition to cause severe disruption to the state of socioeconomic, socio-ecological ills that we are currently facing. So the big question that we face, yes, we're part of an energy transition. How do we make that energy transition just? And that's a central question in how we've been trying to unpack the energy transition within South Africa, as well as many of the other regions around us. And what does a just energy transition then mean? Within South Africa, we've been trying to look at it in three ways. We've been trying to look at distributive justice, restorative justice, as well as proceed how the transition is going to unfold, okay? Who is participating and who is being represented within the transitioning decisions that we're making? How are the gains and the losses actually being distributed? So we don't only get some people gaining and some people are losing. And how is the benefit of the transition actually being more broadly distributed? And then, can the transition actually help us to restore some of the socio-economic ills that the country is facing? So when we examine the energy transition in South Africa, it's important to remember that this is not a transition from coal to renewables, okay? It's not a transition, or it's not intended to be a technological transition. It's much bigger than that. It's a disruptive, it's a socio-economic disruption, and hopefully will be putting us on a new growth path in South Africa. Now, let's just look at how we're seeing the impact of some, coming to the question that you asked around the impact in the labor market. South Africa has a large coal mining workforce, okay? A lot of it is concentrated in Mpumalanga. The Presidential Climate Commission estimates that about 100,000 people are directly employed in coal mining in South Africa. And it's about 100,000 people that we're estimating their jobs will be at risk by around 2050. Now, the range of occupations that research is actually highlighting is going to be cross-cutting, from machine operators to supervisors, technicians, engineers. But the most vulnerable are going to be the unskilled workers. A lot of the talk and the discussion has been around technical jobs. A lot of the reskilling efforts, okay, or lots of the reskilling discussions has focused around scientific work and technical jobs. The second part of the impact of the transition is to look at the indirect occupations, to look at the indirect impacts of the transition. If we had to look at jobs around transport, jobs around in the coal jobs around the transport of coal, jobs around the import of coal in the ports, there's a wide range of indirect jobs that are also being impacted. And there are figures that our Climate Commission is predicting of how this impact will start to unfold. However, in South Africa, in our transition, we've taken 3 priority sectors to focus on in our investment plan. We've taken the sector of renewables. We have taken the movement to energy, electric vehicles, and hydrogen. Across these 3, in the short term, within renewables, we're estimating about 85,000 jobs to be created by about 2030. Very contested figures. But in terms of electrification, Siri wants to tell me what to do. In terms of electrifying vehicles, we're estimating around 120,000 jobs by 2035. And in the hydrogen, which is the third key area that South Africa has identified, we're estimating about 40,000 jobs by 2030. So in aggregate total, South Africa is arguing that by 2035, the net total, we will actually produce and create more jobs in the energy transition than will have been lost. How this actually is going to happen is the real challenge. And a very important part of that is to be proactive in about how we're looking at skills planning, to have credible, reliable, and proactive skills planning mechanisms. It's important to move beyond the kind of magical thinking of, yes, this is 300,000 jobs are going to be created, to actually have very concrete ideas of how we're going to get there. And proactive skilling is part of that. I just want to raise two challenges where we are at the moment in South Africa in this energy transition. One is, and you can see from the choice of the three sectors, in South Africa, the transition is being led as a technological transition. It's technologically biased. And at the moment, we're quite driven by the idea of implementing the technology. The disadvantage or the constraint around this is that skills responses are being framed, and the ideas of what kind of proactive training is required or what kind of proactive skilling responses are actually required is framed around what do we require to implement a technology. Often, this is producing a scenario where we're continually talking about technical jobs. And it's producing a phenomenon that in occupational researchers in South Africa, we're starting to call occupational stacking against technical jobs. So almost study after study is saying the occupations that are being impacted are engineers and technicians. So we get a lot of attention around engineers and technicians in these technical occupations. The issue there is, one, I believe engineers and technicians will ultimately take care of themselves. But secondly, is very little of the information that's emerging around the impact on the labor market can tell us how engineers' jobs are being impacted, what kinds of engineers, which parts of the value chains, exactly how are these jobs changing. That type of nuanced, differentiated occupational information, which is required to help us to understand exactly what is the occupational impact of the transition. That kind of information, that depth of occupational information, we're not able to surface. There's a lot of data in South Africa and across the SADC region that's giving us predictions, predictive ideas of impact on the labor market. But workplace-based studies, going inside work and understanding how labor processes are actually going to change, how occupational tasks are going to be shifted, even if it is going to be the jobs of technicians, how will the jobs actually change? That kind of nuanced occupational information around how it's impacting the transition is not available. So that's a key challenge in about how we're thinking about occupational change and shift around the labor market. There's this very general magical thinking. Jobs are going to be created. Jobs will be lost, but jobs will be created. Okay, the second issue that I want to put on the table that I think all of us involved in the energy transition is coming back to where I started. What is our actual, what's the center of our goal? Where's the center point of what we want to achieve? And where we are now, we have to face the reality that the current direction of the transition that we're in is problematic. The directionality of the transition in Africa has left poverty and inequality intact. And many of the multiple scenarios, the different scenarios are still in existence. It's actually escalated in the last 3 years, alongside the fact that we've seen the biggest growth in renewables that the region has experienced. Which brings us then to the point that the energy transition in Africa actually needs something much more radical, much more disruptive to the whole, a much more whole system approach than the types of fragmented approaches that's technologically biased that we're setting ourselves up for at present. I think I'm going to pause there. I think I've given lots of different perspectives.
Thank you, Presha. I think you've highlighted some really important points that are, we see in Asia as well in terms of how the transition is not really addressing issues of inequality, and it is just replicating existing inequality. Mark, I'd love to hear from you to understand better what, how you are experiencing and analyzing the transition in the MENA region, and what are the differences and similarities that you see based on, what we just heard from Presha.
Yeah, thank you so much, Prerna, and thank you so much for having me on the webinar. So when looking at the from the perspective of the MENA region, just like one general idea on this is that we cannot really talk about the region as one entity or as a region as a whole. So what I will try to dissect in the coming few minutes is just how the transition is happening in different contexts because of the different fragmentation that's happening in the region, who is being able to benefit from that transition, but who's also impacted in terms of this. So when you look at the MENA region, we can identify three different categories of countries within the region. So first, we can think or see the conflict impacted areas, or the areas that are under either wars or conflict and economic crisis. And there are several examples of this that have been happening over the past decade in this regard. So the energy transition is in these countries has happened as a consequence of the conflict or as a consequence of the crisis, and it has happened in a chaotic, unorganized way, and as an emergency tool, if I may say that, and as a need. It resulted as a need to the crises that were resolved. So people didn't really think that they had a need to go there, but with the absence of energy sources from the central governments due to the different conflict, there was a shift towards those. So in those contexts, this unorganized or chaotic movement had new incomers in terms of labor. So everyone, for example, over the past few years in Lebanon, when the economic crisis, a lot of new incomers to the industry of solar energy and renewable energy started working out of a sudden in that context. But also there were early leavers, because because of the unorganized shift that happened there, those new incomers didn't have the opportunity to sustain their businesses and to grow their businesses, and they just entered, and after a few years they left because of the absence of a framework for that, because of the absence of funding. So one positive side of things is that awareness among people, particularly in conflict-impacted areas, and I can give plenty of examples. We can talk about what happened in Yemen since 2015. We can talk about what's happening in Syria, in Palestine to some extent as well, and most of the in Sudan currently, what's happening in those countries that are under extreme pressures. So these opportunities for the energy transition, shift of labor and shift of work opportunities were short-lived. There were temporary jobs that were created, mostly, in distribution, installation, O&M, etc., but they were really not sustainable. So this is the first group of countries in which, and I'll come shortly in a minute to the challenges among those models, because there are common challenges in those. So there was no real transfer of skills to the people of those countries in that group in that category. But we can also look at another category, which are the more promising markets, the more stable context in the MENA region. We can talk about Egypt, we can talk about Jordan, North African countries like Tunisia, Morocco as well. These were on board of the energy transition, and they were trying to get on board of this transition, but we are always missing the big elephant in the room here, and this is something across the whole region. When we're talking about the MENA region, we're talking about a heavily reliant region on fossil fuels. So currently it has around 200 billion annually if we combine all the countries together that are spent on oil and gas. we have among the lowest share of renewable energy in the world, in the region particularly, while we are benefiting, or the region benefit from one of the best resources in terms of potential, particularly solar energy. So those promising markets and promising countries, although they are examples of potential like growth in energy transition, and we might come again later to some examples about that, but we didn't really see yet a shift in market. We didn't see some jobs being removed and some new jobs being created, or the percentage of those jobs is very minimal compared to the ones in the fossil fuel industry. Which leads me to the third group, which when we talk about the GCC countries, where we see an continuous announcement on the need to transition to renewable energies, but this is really not happening on the ground because of this heavy reliance on renewable energies. So but if you want, the remarkable thing in this area is that we are seeing more and more creation of jobs that are at the managerial level. And I'll come, like, this is something that was mentioned also by Prisha when it comes to high-skilled jobs, engineers, a lot of high-level, high-skilled jobs on the energy transition, but we are missing also the lower end, the medium-skilled and low-skilled jobs that are needed for this. So generally speaking, I'll mention 3 challenges when it comes to the MENA region. One is that the technologies are still imported from abroad. We are not talking about any manufacturing opportunities in this region. We are talking about a lot of imports, and most of the jobs that are created are more in the wholesale, distribution, retail, or installation, O&M of renewable energy technologies. But this is something at the policy level to mention. There is a lack of transfer of skills. Putting aside some of the examples in Jordan, for example, and in Egypt over the past years, there is no transfer of skills to those, and thus no creation of new jobs after projects being commissioned and operational. Second, there is a need to mention that we need to prepare fossil fuel workers in the coming decade and the coming few years, and leading to the coming decade, that this continuous reliance and this heavy reliance on those will come somehow to a certain imbalance. And we need to shift, we need to prepare those workers in order for them to shift to other opportunities. Third is, as I said, there's a lot of emphasis on high-skilled workers. So the energy transition is high-skilled, needs high-skilled labor. It needs high-tech potential. And in this sense, we are seeing a lot of reliance as if on engineering opportunities, on educational opportunities in the engineering fields, but we are missing the medium skilled jobs and the lower skilled job, where a bulk of those opportunities will arise in the coming years when a lot of those technologies will be implemented. So there needs to be an emphasis on the need for more technicians, for more opportunities in rather than importing those, or there's no problem in importing them for the first few years, but we need to transfer those skills from the developed countries to developing countries, and to create some centers of excellence for those technologies. And I'm talking about not only solar, but also wind, bioenergy, and all those, all the emerging technologies in this sense. So this fragmentation makes it a bit difficult to assess which countries are will be creating more jobs, will be allowing more opportunities in this, and it is more difficult to quantify depending on the fossil fuel lobby and the fossil fuel countries really shifting towards those technologies, to quantify the amount of opportunities to be created, and hence the amount that might be lost in the future.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for highlighting, the differences within the region as well as the importance of building skills within the region. I'd like to shift to Gregory now and talk about, within country differences, specifically with respect to spatial inequality, and how does the energy transition impact spatial inequality, and what impact does that have on local labor markets? I know Gregory's been doing a lot of work with respect to this, so we'd love to hear more about your research and what are the implications this has for policy.
Sure. Thanks so much, Prerna, and thanks to Presha and Mark for their comments so far. I'm really glad to be part of this discussion. So I'd like to start with sort of a broad claim, which is that I think that one of the things that's often missing from our discussions on reskilling for the energy transition, but more broadly, our discussions on what a just transition looks like, is the question of geography. And what I mean by that is that sort of we know from past sort of major technological and energy transitions that these major transformations have uneven impacts across different places. So we can see that, for example, in the major transitions around digitalization and globalization, sort of what's called the third industrial revolution, that this had really different impacts in different places. And what I mean by that is different countries, but also different regions within countries. And we know now that that sort of third industrial revolution has increased inequality between regions virtually everywhere in the world, including in most global South countries. So if we know that these sort of large-scale transitions have different impacts on different places within countries, different regions within countries, then this has to become a really critical lens of analysis for understanding sort of what the energy transition will mean in terms of its impact on local economies and local labor markets. So to illustrate this, we can think about the case of India, which of course is one of the largest countries in the global South, and also one of the countries that faces some of the highest levels of regional inequality. India has sort of this kind of spatial rift in its development patterns between the northern and eastern parts of the country, which tend to be the poorest, and the southern and western states, which tend to be some of the most prosperous. And we can see already in the way that the renewable energy sector is developing in the country that this development is reinforcing these existing spatial inequalities. So when we think about these big transitions, they have the potential to address or to reduce some of these spatial inequalities, but they also have the potential to enhance them. And so what we see in the case of India is that renewable energy development is enhancing them. And the way it's enhancing them is that the most prosperous states in the country, in the South and West, have been much faster in the development of renewable energy as compared to the North and the Eastern parts of the country. And this is going to have long-run impacts on these spatial inequalities, because right now, sort of the fossil fuel industry is actually more concentrated in the poorer parts of the country. So the coal reserves that India has are disproportionately located in the eastern states, which are some of the least developed. And up till now, this has had kind of somewhat of an offsetting effect on regional disparities, because the richer states essentially have to buy energy from the poorer states. And so this kind of gives the poorer states a little bit more fiscal space to spend on social welfare programs, et cetera. But what Sanjay Mitra and Rohit Chandra at IIT Delhi have found is that by about the middle of the 21st century, the poor states in India will actually be buying energy from the rich states if current trends sort of continue. And this is related to the potential for renewable energy, but it's also related to institutional factors. These more prosperous states have the ability to fund, to site, and to build renewable energy infrastructure faster than the poorer states. And we can imagine all of the downstream impacts that has on job creation, but also on sort of broader trends in local and regional economic development. And then at Just Jobs, we've been also looking at this spatial question with regard to the transition from internal combustion manufacturing to electric vehicle manufacturing. So this is to Presha's point that we have to look beyond just sort of the energy sector itself to understand these wider impacts on economies. And the auto manufacturing sector is one of the largest in India in terms of employment. And what we find in that analysis is similar, which is that the southern states in India, and specifically this kind of industrial belt between Bangalore and Chennai, has been moving much more quickly than other parts of the country in developing its EV manufacturing sector. And this has to do a lot with the concentration of high-skilled engineers, particularly from sort of the information technology and software industries, because the sort of technology that's involved in creating an electric vehicle emphasizes those kinds of skills much more than sort of the mechanical skills that are traditional in the manufacturing of traditional, internal combustion vehicles. So what we're finding is that this also this part of the transition also has the potential to reinforce and amplify these existing regional inequalities in India. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because it means that people not only have to face a barrier in terms of gaining the skills required for the new jobs that are being created, but also that they face migration barriers to actually getting to the locations where those jobs are being created. And we know that Global South countries have higher migration barriers, even domestically, than countries in the Global North do. And in countries like India, this comes with not only concerns around can a migrant access, for example, social welfare benefits, but also it comes with various kinds of anti-migrant politics, right? So there's issues around local and regional forms of nativism where communities don't want sort of what they consider to be foreigners, even though they're citizens of the same country, entering their local society and local job markets. So in these sort of very large, plural and complex countries like India, you have many different kinds of migration barriers that might prevent people from accessing the new jobs being created. So I'll stop there, but I want to emphasize the role of geography and migration in these conversations.
Thank you, Gregory. Yeah, that's very insightful and a good reminder of keeping the geographical lens as far as these issues are concerned. Presha, I'd like to turn to you next. And given the extensive work you've done on understanding the changing nature of skills requirement with respect to the energy transition, it would be really good for us to hear from you on, what role does education and skilling play in preparing the workforce to leverage opportunities presented by this transition? But more importantly, what are the challenges around skills training that would prevent workers from undertaking this transition? Over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I think we've heard some really interesting and good perspectives today, and I think it all have helped us to see how complex transitioning processes are. Because we're not just changing a technology, you're changing rules and norms and societies and infrastructures and patterns of geography and migratory patterns, and there's a whole lot involved in trying to support workforces within the transition. And I think that an important argument that's always forgotten here or underplayed is that the skilling itself cannot make the transition just. All of the issues that was raised in the first session are central. So when we frame skills responses, or when we're thinking about skilling, I know, and I don't know exactly what it's like in India and other parts, but in South Africa, it seems that everyone seems to place the responsibility of making the transition just at the education, at the site of education, and using education as a leverage point for making the transition just. But I just wanted to start off there. What we're seeing is that in this context of high uncertainty, very ad hoc, and I think we heard this come out already in the ad hoc fragmented implementation responses, instead of the kind of deep thinking, systemic responses that's actually required. And one of the issues of why it's not finding a home properly across the skill system is that skill systems really struggle to deal with cross-cutting issues, because a lot of, especially post-school education, is around sectors. So when you've got an issue like something like sustainability or something like energy that's cross-cutting, crossing different occupations, crossing different disciplinary areas, it's really difficult for educational systems to make sense of the implications for education. So that's giving us some of the time lag that we have. Secondly, everything is moving so quickly. The educational system responses are much slower than the kind of pace that economist modeling is actually going at. And what's that setting up, and I'll speak from Africa at the moment now, is a short course culture. That's the one thing that we're seeing. We're seeing a strong short course culture. So if we look at South Africa, about 77% of the provisioning that's happening at the moment is short course unaccredited. Now, in the context of high youth unemployment, in the context of trying to create proper learning pathways that's going to build careers for young people, short course cultures are problematic, and we can have another discussion one day about that. The second issue with a large percentage, over 70% of the provisioning that's actually happening, and this could tangentially link to Greg's point as well. In South Africa, we're seeing is happening in Gauteng and the Western Cape. Most of, and if you remember what I mentioned, the coal region in South Africa is in Mpumalanga. It's where the mines are. Most of the provisioning that's actually available is happening between 6 to 14 hours away from where the mines actually are. So the patterns of provisioning that are starting to emerge, and who has access to the provisioning, are some of the questions that we need to see. And I think that part of that is this ad hoc responsiveness, this quick wins, we need to respond now type of mentality. Mark raised the issue about medium-skilled and low-income jobs. Now, in the context of 65% youth unemployment, the entry points into the energy sector is a critical question. We need to know and understand, where can young people enter the sector? Young people are not going to enter, large numbers are not going to enter at high-skilled level. We need to understand the entry points, and then we need to be able to understand, where can they transition to? So from entering, what is the lateral transitioning that these young people can do? What's the vertical transitioning? So what are the actual learning pathways for these entry-level jobs? And what do we know about that? And then make provisioning decisions around that. That's not happening at the moment. We know the least from all of the information, and we've been tracking information emerging in multiple levels. We know the least about entry-level and medium-level jobs. There's most known about high-skilled jobs, okay? We know the least about where those entry levels are. We know even less about the learning pathways related to those jobs, how those young people can transition. And that brings us to the ad hoc types of provisioning and skills responses that we're actually seeing. So we're bringing young people into training programs. They're being trained with short courses, but the possibilities for where they can actually work. And in South Africa, the discourse is continuously changing. Now we're told it's not actually a learning pathway, it's a job opportunity. And from that job opportunity, they'll craft a pathway for themselves. But building resilient education systems, we must have a much more coherent idea, a systemic idea of where these energy pathways are, where the entry points for these jobs are, how people can move, what are some of the feeder jobs, where can people enter, what are the parallel pathway, what are the feeder jobs that can lead to these entry-level jobs. And that's the kind of information that we actually do not have at the moment. So the information that can help us to actually ensure that we provision for the most vulnerable groups is the information we're struggling to find out in terms of education within the transition. And then the last point before I give back to you is there's also this shift on this idea around entrepreneurship, and I'm not sure if it's happening across Asia as well. There's a lot of attention that we need to use the TVET colleges, and we need to go into communities and build entrepreneurship and enterprise development work streams to allow people. And there's very little evidence that these are working, that people are creating sustainable livelihoods from these. In these kind of contexts, they need much more than entrepreneurship training to be able to make and to create sustainable livelihoods. So I think that this idea and this framing that we seem to be quick responses that seems to be driving. We need this. Let's build a qualification. As soon as we have a qualification, people will be able to do the qualification and people will find work. Is just not going to cut it. We need a much more proactive, coordinated response to how we understanding what the learning pathways are in the energy sector, with special emphasis on entry and medium skilled work. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Presha. And, all the issues that you've raised are very similar to what we see in Asia as well. And, it's been actually a cross-cutting theme through all the webinars that we've had in this series about how the approach to skilling is so ad hoc. It's so, the focus on short courses and how that, when the educational foundation is weak, that really doesn't address the issue. So thank you for that. I am mindful of time, and I know we're running out of time, so I very quickly would like to bring in Aryan at this point. Aryan, you've got your eye on sustainability-focused projects across the globe. And so we'd really like to hear from you on what, in your opinion, is required to make skilling approaches work. And if you could also, if there are examples or projects that you've seen, that have succeeded in, addressing some of the issues that we've been talking about with respect to skilling for the energy transition, that would be great to hear. But yes, over to you.
Thank you, Prerna, and thanks to the other speakers. In the interest of time, let me do this very briefly. I think I think the story about, if you look at India, is very similar, right? As like most estimates say, there will be about 1 million job losses from transitioning out of fuel, and then maybe 2 million, new jobs that will come up. And the numbers, I mean, we don't actually know what is happening right now, and in a way the two are unrelated. And I thought Greg's point was really important, right? It's like it can actually, I mean, mine is almost a Marxist or a biblical interpretation of the same, right? Those who have shall be given, right? That's my kind of Matthew version of what Greg said. It's like this. So important prior is that preceding inequalities are always very important to how this transition is happening. And in this specific area, we did some work. There was a paper for the T20 where we looked at, there was this expectation of that clean energy transition is actually mostly in poorer countries, low-income countries, mostly in Africa, and the findings there are this promise that that clean energy will provide opportunities for women, will be good for growth, for entrepreneurship, and will be good for the environment, of course. Run into quite simply, standard implementation issues of all development interventions. Plus, again, if you look at the access that women have, in particular, a focus that we have is like those traditional barriers are not easily overcome. It's not impossible, but the evidence shows it's not that easy. I don't need to remind you of your own work that looked at a similar question in terms of the platform economies, right? And the platform workers that would provide great opportunities for women. And they were there, but equally important were the fact that imbalances in power relations, the force of the strength of the employers overwhelmed women. The preceding gender inequalities always continue to exist. So with that, I have two specific conclusions to see if this adds to the conversation. The first thing to say, I think it's really important to. This is more my history. Trained in history, the history background is like inequalities are not addressed by technologies by itself. Technologies are not good or bad, right? It's of course how they're used. So let's stop. Let's not stop asking those questions, but let's get beyond that. It was always how technologies are being used. Inequalities are also not addressed by some magic government policy. Government policy has a very important role to play, but it is, workers arguing, and farmers, that includes farmers, right? They're like people with access to resources, women's groups that are fighting for that inequality, that ensures how that technology will in the end be used for, whether they address inequalities or whether they reinforce equality. And I'm saying that because I don't think we pay enough emphasis in our work, researchers more generally, to the importance of workers organizing in a broad sense, right? Grassroots organization, the role of women in India organizing themselves, which make development projects a success. It's a condition. It's almost a condition sine qua non, and particularly, of course, addressing this inequality. So let's pay attention to that. And finally, then the inequalities in the education system are very important. And I'd like to distinguish two somewhat unrelated, and maybe they are related. I think they have origin in the same problem, but there are very distinct problems. One is that the systems of education have a very colonial background, and that expresses itself, for example, in the priority that is given, the status that is given to university education, right? And that's not where this change is going to come from, right? We really need to focus on the work and pressure. I think I'm supporting your point. I don't know about the short-term courses thing, but I think I'm supporting this. Like there needs to be a much stronger focus on colleges, on TVET, and one of the IDRC projects, we're happy to share that with you, in Kenya actually focused on that. Like, how would things change if the providers of education, the planners of education, sit together with the industries and with workers and say, like, hey, what are the needed skills? Now that kind of system is very common in Germany, but is not very common in countries where its education system still has that bias. And the second part of that, like I said, they have the same origin, I think, but they're not related, is that the education system in itself, one, in the case of India, where the number of places in good colleges are so limited compared to, and where so much of the education, and probably increasingly, is private, that education system itself also will reinforce those inequalities. The new skills are more, of those 2 million new jobs in India, say, are more demanding, require higher skill, to be an intensified competition, and the kids come through those very unequal education. So it's very likely that there will be exceptions. This is not a generalization, but on the whole, that those inequality systems need to be addressed, both in terms of kind of the structure of it, with the more focus on Tibet, as well as creating more opportunities for marginalized groups. Otherwise, if my prior is true, that technology by itself is not determining, you have two key factors that are likely to increase those inequalities. But are, there are opportunities to address those. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aryan. And in the interest of time, I would like to open it up for Q&A with the audience. I think we can probably take a couple of questions. We are almost out of time. So, I still have more questions and follow-ups for our speakers, but I'm going to pull back and hand it over to see if anybody has any questions. And in the meantime, while we are, getting questions from the audience, if any of our speakers have any last comments or thoughts that you would like to share, please do go ahead.
I'll just make one quick point, Prerna, which is that, and this has sort of come up a little bit in some of the comments, but I want to make sure we underscore it, which is that this energy transition is really a whole of economy transition. And so if our analyses on whether it's skills or inequality, if our analyses are limited to just the energy sector itself, and maybe, an extension in sort of the resources sector, such as mining, we're really missing sort of the wider reverberations of this transition. And we're missing an opportunity to study how it will impact sectors such as agriculture or construction, right? Because decarbonization as a policy priority is likely to impact virtually every sector of the economy. And so we really cannot take a sectoral approach to this and just look at the energy sector itself. So that's just one point I wanted to highlight.
Thank you, Craig. Mark, is there anything that you would like to add? And I had a question for you in terms of understanding what policy architecture is required to manage this transition. But I'd like to leave it open-ended if there's any additional comments that you'd like to add to the discussion.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo this point of Greg on although we're thinking, or in our context, when they talk about the transition, we're focusing on energy. This is not only energy, because other things will follow. And just as a takeaway in terms of this policy framework, it's not only about setting policies or putting things vertically integrated and getting it down, because we should go the other way around. We should, to avoid such inequalities, we should make this transition a people-centered thing and people-centered approach. We should be inclusive and diverse as well in this approach. This is not only about setting a policy and just going towards this, while some people might be benefiting from that, and as if we're increasing those inequalities. Another thing is, I'll also emphasize on the point of education, because everything starts there, and there is a change in the way of people think now about education, and there should be a more push towards creating new programs, offering more scholarship at this end, co-designing training programs and opportunities between the leaders or the leading countries in this regard, and also some of the global South countries, to complement what also Prisha mentioned, those young professionals who are going out of college as well. They really need to know where to go, what to apply for, and what's needed also in the market. We might not need always engineers. We might not need a lot we are not thinking about the manufacturing side of things and the technician side of things. So there's a whole of a system approach for this that should be in a diverse, equal, and inclusive way.
Absolutely. And, I think this is a great note to end on. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This was an extremely insightful and engaging discussion. And we at the Just Jobs Network are definitely going to go back and share the recording, as well as share the summary of the discussion. So thank you so much for joining us, and please do stay tuned for more events from the FuturWORKS Collective and Just Jobs Network. Thank you so much.